Just, I'll blame you, Eric.
Okay, we're live.
Oh, we're live. See?
Oh, don't blame
Good
me.
morning. This is a joint meeting of the Senate Committee on Judiciary and the Senate Committee on Health and Welfare. It is February 1st, 2023, and we're taking up this morning S36, an act relating to permitting an arrest without a warrant for assaults and threats against healthcare workers and disorderly conduct at healthcare facilities. We will start this morning with Eric Fitzpatrick from Legislative Counsel, who drafted the bill and worked with various senators before the introduction, as well as the Hospital Association, the Medical Society, and others. This is a very serious problem in our state and in other states, and we hope to be able to help to address it in some way through S36. So, Eric, if you start the walkthrough. And we all have a document from Vermont Association of Hospitals and Health Systems. Workplace violence against healthcare workers is unacceptable. And this is the document I'm referring to. And it goes over some of the attempts that healthcare facilities have tried to use to reduce the violence and eliminate it, and why they need our help. So with that, Eric, if you would just walk through the bill.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. I'm Eric Fitzpatrick with the Office of Legislative Counsel, here to talk with the committee and give a walkthrough of S36, which is an act relating to permitting an arrest without a warrant for assaults and threats against healthcare workers and disorderly conduct at healthcare facilities. As you can surmise from the title, the proposed legislation in the bill is pretty straightforward. It permits a law enforcement officer to make an arrest without a warrant, provided that the officer has probable cause for three particular criminal offenses. These three particular criminal offenses are assaulting a healthcare worker at a healthcare facility, threatening a healthcare worker at a healthcare facility, and engaging in disorderly conduct at a healthcare facility that interferes in the provision of critical medical services. So with those three particular criminal offenses, the idea of the bill is to provide the law enforcement officer with authority to make an arrest without a warrant. Now, for a moment or two of background, it's helpful to know that the ability of a law enforcement officer to arrest without a warrant is already in law. So that is an existing feature of law enforcement's authority under Rule 3 of the Vermont Rules of Criminal Procedure. Interestingly, it used to be in statute. Many years ago, it was in 1973, a historical detour, but in 1973, the provision of Rule 3 that you now see, which lists the circumstances under which an arrest can be made without a warrant, was in statute. It was moved over to rule back then, and it has been in rule ever since. However, the legislature, and I suspect Senator Shears will remember this, has over the years periodically added offenses to Rule 3 that expand a law enforcement officer's ability to make this warrantless arrest. So it is a legislative policy decision for you whether or not you want to add offenses to that list that already exists. And as we'll see from the numbers, I think there's, I want to say 15 or so of these particular warrantless misdemeanors, 17 actually. So there's 17 that exist already. This proposes to add the three more that I identified at the beginning. Another moment or two of background, as you might expect when we're talking about arrest without a warrant, there is a constitutional underpinning to this. There are constitutional implications. That is covered by the language of the rule. It's intertwined with the rule, and that basically the principle that the Constitution imposes on this is that, in fact, it applies whether there's an arrest with a warrant or an arrest without a warrant, there has to be probable cause. That's the constitutional requirement. Under the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution, Article 11 of the Vermont Constitution imposes a reasonableness requirement. This person cannot be seized unreasonably, and that has been interpreted to mean probable cause. It's unreasonable if there's no probable cause. If there is probable cause, it's reasonable, it's constitutional. And that applies whether you have a warrant or whether you don't. In this particular case, the bill we're about to take a look at, this applies to warrantless arrests. If you think about it, there's two options, right? A law enforcement officer could go to a judge and present evidence, this usually an affidavit, not only of the officer, but could be other people, other evidence, and the judge could issue a warrant, and the officer could then go execute it and arrest the person on the basis of this warrant. That, if you think about it, is a way that the judicial officer has been involved in the proceeding beforehand. They've pre-authorized this arrest. They've satisfied the constitutional standard of probable cause because they looked at what the officer presented and said, okay, and sometimes they say no. So they have to make a decision in that moment. They decide there's sufficient probable cause, the warrant's issued, the officer executes it. What we're talking about now is the other situation. There hasn't been a warrant. The officer is able to make an arrest on the scene without a warrant because they have probable cause. So the constitutional threshold is satisfied in that way. So good background to have because it's certainly a big part of warrantless arrest generally. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn to the language and the existing language because that incorporates what I just mentioned. You'll see. So this one more moment of background because you'll see that the way that Rule 3 is divvied up also is for historical reasons. It's divvied up between witnessed offenses, at least with misdemeanors, witnessed misdemeanors, non-witnessed. Why is that? Well, because historically, and again, this goes a lot further back than 73, this goes back to like the 17th century, but historically, the way the common law and the courts looked at the ability to arrest without a warrant, they divvied it up between felonies and misdemeanors and witnessed and non-witnessed. So if there was a felony, you could arrest without a warrant. Always, period. If it was a misdemeanor, it depended on whether, when I say witnessed or not, what did it happen in the presence of the officer? So if the officer was there, it's witnessed. And in that case, they could arrest without a warrant. If it was non-witnessed, if it happened outside, and again, you'll see how, this is a big factor for the current bill that you're looking at because the officer may or may not be there in the healthcare facility when the violent conduct occurred. When the crime occurred, they may be there, they may not be there. This addresses the situation where they're not there because if they were there, if they were present and they witnessed it, the rule already says they can arrest them without a warrant. No problem. Issue arises when they're not there. It's non-witnessed. And in that non-witness situation, that is where the most activity that the legislature has taken over the last 20 years or so has been. And that's where offenses have been added to this list periodically. And usually when an offense is added, it's typically based on a situation where there's some kind of dangerousness involved to a victim or to the offender themselves, whether there's some immediate investigatory need, whether there's some kind of harm that could happen very quickly unless the arrests were made right away. So that's sort of the rationale that's justified, the legislature has used to justify adding to this list of offenses. And that's what this proposal is to do, to add three more to that list of, what did I say? 17, I think? Yeah, 17 right now. So that's the big picture background of where this fits in existing law. Yep.
Senator.
Thanks, Eric. So my first question has to do with Rule 3 and simple assault, and then what's written on lines 13 to 15 on page 2. So I know that presently you can arrest for simple assault. And so what I'm wondering is this section 18 or subsection 18, is that incorporating a new crime into Rule 3 or what's going on there? Because it seems duplicative to have simple assault in Rule 3 and then say again, assault against a healthcare worker, unless it's a different crime.
It's not, and you're absolutely right, and that's actually why I included. If we're looking at it, good that we have that. We have these two existing provisions. 8 and 14 are existing crimes under which a warrantless arrest can be made. So you're absolutely right that there's some crossover. That the proposed addition of lines 13 to 15, person committing a misdemeanor that involves an assault against a healthcare worker in a healthcare facility, that could also be covered by simple assault. Absolutely. Same is true, though, if you look at existing law, look at number 8. Under existing law, also permits a warrantless arrest for a misdemeanor which involves an assault against a family member. Again, that would also be covered by simple assault. So I think it's a policy determination for you, that you're right, that technically, it's probably covered by simple assault. Does the fact that you've identified the healthcare worker in a healthcare facility create a policy on the part of the legislature that you particularly want those sorts of offenses to be sure that they're included and that could be made the warrantless arrest? That's a policy call for you. But I think you're right, as a technical matter. Same way with existing subdivision 8. Probably the officer could do it if they charge with simple assault. But this might send a more clear directive.
Because I interpreted 8, subsection 8 to be for domestic assault. But yeah, I see your point. Thank you.
Yeah.
The goal was to put together legislation that would mirror what we do with domestic violence right now in terms of these arrests that allowing to be seen that way, similar to domestic violence, the ability to immediately remove the person, the offender, from the facility or whatever the healthcare situation is, was paramount in trying to prevent some of these assaults and other behaviors. I think that's why it's the way it is. I realize it's.
Could I, before we move on to something else, could I follow? Because I neglected to mention something else as well, which is that, and let's see if I can pull this up on my screen and find the right site. Yes, so there actually is, though, in addition to the simple assault offense, there is this species of assault offense called assault of a protected professional. Mm-hmm. And that's I think, yeah, hopefully it did come up. So this is, if you have a simple assault against a protected professional, it's a separate, distinct offense. And that's what is being referred to in the new language that you're looking at. And if you look at the definition of protected professional, this is existing law, includes a number of things and includes a healthcare worker. So it's cross-referencing that sort of separate, distinct offense for assaulting a healthcare worker.
That's the 1028D.
Yes, exactly.
Then Senator Hardy.
If an incident happens and I know a couple of the facilities around my district, they have security. Those security, would they be qualified to say that it happened and that would be probable cause enough?
That would certainly go into the probable cause, absolutely. If you mean they witnessed it.
So what happens if the perpetrator, the security confronts him and the individual leaves? Would this police officer have to go get a warrant to arrest him?
Not necessarily. Again, everything depends on the particular facts and circumstances. But if the officer felt that the testimony of the security officer who was there and whatever other evidence there might be that the assault had happened, maybe there was a video camera or maybe there were other people who saw it, whatever it might be that would tend to show that the assault had happened, up to the officer to decide. That's an important decision they have to make, which is that evidence enough to establish probable cause? If they think it is, they could make the arrest.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Eric,
we wouldn't need this.
yeah, but the security officer would have to be a certified law enforcement officer to make an arrest.
No, I wasn't saying they could make the arrest. I think it was Ken, the officer who comes, do it based on what the security officer tells them.
Okay.
I think.
Right. Okay. So if that was the case, then we wouldn't really need this.
No, I think what this provides them the authority to do is to, they would not be able, I may have misunderstood your question. I was assuming you meant if this bill had become law. If it weren't, and the situation you described happened as it did, in that case, the misdemeanor would have taken place outside the presence of the law enforcement officer. So in that case, it's trickier to say whether they would have the authority to do it or not. They might be able to go under the existing simple assault, one that Senator Hasim was referring to, which is number 14, right? So that's possible. So it might be that they would be able to make the arrest, even though they didn't witness it, under existing subdivision 14. The proposal, I think, is to make it more clear.
Okay.
I have a question afterwards.
Senator Hardy and then Senator Lyons.
Thank you, Senator Sears. Eric, I was going to ask you for the statutory citation, but I think I found it. What that you had pulled up on the screen before. It's 13 VSA 1028. Is that
Yes.
what you had?
Exactly.
It seems like that section, the assault of a protected professional, already covers what this bill would do because it includes healthcare facility and healthcare worker. And protected professional includes healthcare workers and emergency medical personnel. So I mean, I know that it's a policy decision as to whether we want to call it out yet again, but doesn't existing law already enable what this bill would also enable? It's just kind of saying it twice.
Yeah, I think it's saying it more explicitly. I think that's what it is. You're right. So the existing statute covers the criminal offense, doesn't say anything about the arrest without a warrant. So yes, it makes the conduct criminal if the person does that. Let's say they assault a healthcare worker in a healthcare facility. So that would be a criminal offense under that 1028 that we're looking at for sure. So that person could be charged with that. The question is, because this bill doesn't create any new criminal offenses, it just says for existing offenses, can you arrest them even though you don't have a warrant? And that's where the addition is made to make that authority more explicit. But I agree with you that they could.
And but didn't you say under current law, you can arrest without a warrant if there's probable cause?
Only for felonies or witness misdemeanors.
Okay, so this would be adding by the law enforcement officer.
Yes, sorry, that's a little unclear. When I say witness, it means it has to be, another way to think of it is in the presence of the law enforcement officer. So if the misdemeanor happens in the presence of the law enforcement officer, they can arrest for sure without a warrant. If the misdemeanor happens outside the presence, non-witnessed, then you have to be on that list that we're just looking at. That list specifically says these offenses outside the presence, they can still arrest.
Okay, and I'm sorry, I'm not on the Judiciary Committee, so I don't know.
That's all right.
The simple assault is a misdemeanor.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
So if the assault happened outside the presence of a law enforcement officer, then this bill would give the law enforcement officer the ability to arrest that person without a warrant.
Correct.
Okay.
Although to add to that, as you.
Similar to domestic violence.
Okay. I'm just trying to figure out which little tiny slice of the pie we're
But
tackling
I think,
or whatever.
I think as we hear testimony from various healthcare professionals, I think you will hear that current practice is not to arrest unless the assault occurs in the presence of the law enforcement
Okay.
officer. When this occurs at a healthcare facility, which is, I think, was one of the reasons that we put the bill in. I realize that technically they may be able to, but are they doing it routinely around the state? And I think the answer is no. And we can hear from the Hospital Association, Medical Society, but the doctors that I've spoken to and the nurses that I've spoken to are very concerned that that's not happening in current practice. I think Senator Lyons and then.
So, Eric, thank you. This is terrific context for us. I will have a question. I think going through, I've got a list of several questions. I'm waiting to hear from the witnesses. But one question is related to rule number 3, which I haven't read recently, and I'm wondering if we'll see a reintroduction of that after this. But the relationship between these particular criteria that are going into rule number 3 and whether or not there will be an elaboration of guidelines and protocols that are associated with those. And I don't know if you have the answer to that or not, but something that I'd be interested in hearing about at some point.
Sure. And did you mean guidelines with respect to sort of
process, whether there are guidelines issued related to this, or there's something included within the rule itself that talks about the disposition of the individual.
I see.
Yeah, that kind of thing. And then the other thing I'm very interested in is if this isn't happening and there are concerns, are there concerns around liability and liability issues? And I'm hoping that we'll hear a little bit about that as we go through some of this. And I do have other questions I'm saving.
Sure.
Here.
Well, just quickly on the former point, yes, the procedures for how the individual arrested is handled, how quickly they have to be brought to court, whether they can be released or not, whether they can be held or detained, all of that is covered in primarily Rule 5 and Rule 46. Two other rules
Okay.
of the rules of criminal procedure do cover those exact issues. And there is quite a bit of process as to, how quickly the person has to get into court and have their initial appearance. That's under Rule 5, what rights they have to be advised of, whether or not they can be detained or not, which is also covered by statute in the Constitution as well. But those things are set out pretty expressly. So there is that background of process that I think you're.
I might come back later with another question after I've listened to folks.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. Thank
And
you.
one last thing, because you might want to, they may already be on the witness list when you were talking about civil liability. You may want to hear from law enforcement about that in terms of immunity,
Yes.
how that works for them.
I just wanted to follow up with Senator Hardy's points. And, while it is somewhat duplicative regarding the simple assault, having Rule 3 is what police officers, memorize, ideally word for word. And that's what really guides their decisions when it comes to, whether or not handcuffs go on a person. And, for example, with domestic assault being in Rule 3, there's really no question. If there's probable cause and it's a domestic assault situation, somebody is very likely going to be arrested. And I can see the point as to how this makes it much more clear for police officers when they're doing their job to know that, all right, we have the elements for simple assault. It was in a healthcare facility. Somebody's going to be getting arrested for it. So, yeah, that's just my comment to what you mentioned.
Are there any other questions for Eric about the bill itself?
Just the last two I'll mention real quick is that we only talked about the misdemeanor assault, but you'll see, remember, there's two other offenses just to be aware of that are also added. Criminal threatening, which is a relatively recent enactment by the legislature. So if it's a separate offense, criminal threatening, that takes place against a healthcare worker on a healthcare facility, also added to that list. So again, the officer would know that specific offense is subject to arrest without a warrant. And lastly, disorderly conduct. So if that occurs in a way that interferes with the provision of medically necessary healthcare services in a healthcare facility, that would also be subject to arrest without a warrant. And just a quick line of what probably would apply from the disorderly conduct statute. That means a person who with intent to cause public inconvenience or annoyance engages in fighting, violent, tumultuous, threatening behavior, makes unreasonable noise, using abusive, obscene language in a public place. So those sorts of things constitute disorderly conduct. So if the officer has probable cause to believe that they were committing that offense in a way that interfered with healthcare services in a healthcare facility, they would have that ability to arrest without a warrant.
I do want to comment on that because as someone who recently spent 5.5 hours in the emergency room at the Albany, New York Medical Center, I can tell you it's very disruptive for the patient when other patients are being disorderly in the emergency room. And so if you're trying to get treatment for something, it doesn't make it easy for them. So, I mean, I realize the focus here is on healthcare workers, but the disruption is also to patients who are in the emergency room, who are awaiting treatment, who may not get the treatment they need because the healthcare professional is spending their time trying to calm somebody who's assaulting them down or swearing at them. And, I heard, derogatory comments at certain people who are healthcare professionals. So we're going to hear that testimony, but I think it's important to keep in mind what an emergency room is for. And all kinds of patients come there for treatment or to deal with issues, and they don't need the added stress at a very stressful time. So.
Senator Sears, I think that's a point too that also is incorporated in the language that you just looked at, which is interesting, the exact thing you're referring to, because for the disturbing the peace provision, it says it's if you commit that, disorderly conduct, if you commit that offense and interfere with the provision of medically necessary healthcare services, it seemed to apply to that situation because you're interfering with the provision of medically important necessary services, could be to another person, not necessarily,
It's easier to blame Albany than one of our.
Can I just comment real quick?
Yeah, and then Senator Hardy.
One thing I just wanted to flag, I'm glad that there is the line that says, interfering with the provision of medically necessary healthcare services. But one thing I just want to think about and put on the table for the many folks who will be testifying today is, especially in emergency rooms when people are dealing with grief and trauma in an emergency situation, and how that manifests itself. And then that line between expressing that grief, but then, if it can turn into disorderly conduct, because I know when people are going through grief, it can be a really challenging situation. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, I just want to make sure that there's a very clear line between people who are going through trauma versus people who are raising it to the level where it's starting to interfere with medically necessary healthcare services. So just something to think about in future testimony.
Yeah, it's a good point for maybe thinking that whether there needs to be some sort of definitional language added or something to provide more guidance on that point. It's a good point.
And that's one of the questions that I'll be asking after we hear testimony. I think the mental health issue will rise to the top in our committee and how that's dealt with as compared with someone who's actually being violent, committing a crime without having a mental illness. So there's a lot embedded in this and questions that I know we're going to hear from folks, so I'm going to hold that, but it's on the table.
Thank you, Senator Sears. I guess I wanted to build on what Senator Hashim and Senator Lyons said. I'm a little concerned with how this interfaces with people who are going to the emergency room for medically necessary care, who may be experiencing trauma or a medical episode themselves that might be misinterpreted as violence, or that might involve, I think there's a fine line. I don't want to discourage people from going to the emergency room who need care because they're worried about getting arrested. And I also think we need to be really careful with the assumption that people who have maybe experiencing a mental health crisis are necessarily violent. People who are experiencing a mental health crisis are more likely to be the victims of violence than to be perpetrators of violence. And so I think we just need to be really careful. And I agree that we might need some more definitional sort of substance to the bill to make sure that we're threading the needle carefully, because I wouldn't want people to not get the care they need because their fear that police might be there to arrest them.
But I think I need to respond. And part of the problem, at least at my local hospital, is people who are held for a very long period of time at that hospital inappropriately, who have psychiatric issues and are not getting the treatment from the state because our mental health system is so broken. And until we fix that system, I think that's where the part of the problem lies. There's always going to be outliers and problems like this that I think this is a good step, and I'm not suggesting that I disagree with you about making sure we protect them, but I think you'll find that part of the problem, and I've been dealing with it in Bennington because of the number of facilities for juveniles that we have in Bennington. It's been kids who are staying there who can't go anywhere else for weeks on end. And they shouldn't be in a hospital bed. They should be in a psychiatric bed for juveniles or a psychiatric bed for adults, and they're just not available.
Yeah.
So until we fix this mental health care system, I think you're going to continue to see this problem. I certainly have a great deal of sympathy for anybody with going through trauma or any kind of grief, and walking into the emergency room to deal with that. But I think by and large, we're talking about people who've been there over 3 days.
So I want to just follow up. I want to concur with the comments that have been made. And then also say that I'm still looking forward to testimony so that we can begin to
Yeah.
discriminate between what is violent behavior that would result in a warrantless arrest. And then where are the places that we can offer some policies that will improve the system? And obviously, mental health is just one of those areas. We've received information from VAS, the Vermont Hospital Association, on about the public inebriate system. We have definitions that we need to look at, and I think that's why these two committees are together. So everything we're talking about now is going to be a broader and fuller discussion after we hear from folks in the room. So
Why don't we-
I want to add that.
Why don't we go to some testimony? And our first witnesses are on Zoom. If Peggy, if you could enlarge the screen so we can see them. And I will, the first witness is Thomas D., who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Southwest Vermont Healthcare.
Thank you, Senator Sears. Good morning. My name is Tom D., President and CEO of Southwestern Vermont Medical Center in Bennington. Thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning in front of this joint hearing. I also appreciate the work being done by Senator Sears and Senator Lyons on the critical issue of workplace violence. I've been the CEO of SVMC for the past 13 years. My healthcare career spans 45 years, of which 34 years have been as a hospital CEO. We're a small healthcare system in the southern region of Vermont, employing approximately 1,300 people. Prior to my position at SVMC, I spent my career at larger facilities in the Hudson Valley region in New York State. Never in my years in healthcare leadership have I seen such a level of physical and verbal abuse, violence, and intimidation of healthcare workers. We must protect our patients and staff from the ever-growing threat of workplace violence. The board and executive leadership at SVMC have taken many steps to protect our workforce over the recent years. For example, we've increased our security presence by transitioning into an external security firm at the hospital. We've contracted with the Bennington Police Department and the Bennington County Sheriff's Department for additional coverage within our emergency room, and I might add at an annual cost of over $400,000. We've installed an additional 75 security cameras throughout our hospital campus. We have provided specific risk avoidance training for our emergency room staff, in addition to a mandatory hospital-wide safety training program for all of our staff called EVADE. We have instituted bi-weekly workplace violence task force, of which I sit on, to oversee all of our internal employee safeguard activities. We've implemented a protective no trespass policy and procedure for removing threatening and harassing patients, family members, and visitors. We have and will continue to conduct active shooter drills in partnership with local police agencies. We've installed lockdown and panic devices in the emergency room as well as within the hospital. We've created response teams to deal with challenging patients and visitors when incidents arise. And we are commencing a community-wide communications campaign regarding our expectations of appropriate behavior within our hospital with a no tolerance policy. Despite these steps, in the past year, 61% of our clinical staff have reported physically aggressive behavior towards them. In 2022, we had 183 workplace violence events. And these are the ones that were reported. Many go unreported. And we're on track to go beyond these numbers this year.
Yeah, I'll ask.
We cannot and we will not sit back. The new reality requires us to focus even more of our attention and resources on this ever-growing problem. I personally have a fiduciary and a moral obligation to protect our employees and the patients we serve. But we need your help. We realize what we are experiencing are major societal issues impacting our entire country. But our mission at SVMC remains clear: to provide exceptional and safe care to the patients we serve. We cannot serve our mission if our workforce is under siege. I'm very proud to say that we have one of the finest nursing care teams in the country, being recognized as one of the select few 5-time Magnet Award-winning nursing organizations in the U.S. This morning, we have 2 of my nursing colleagues here to speak about their experience of workplace violence. We could have easily brought many more. I want to personally thank Senator Sears for recently visiting with representatives from the SVMC emergency staff to hear firsthand what is taking place in our hospital and within other hospitals in Vermont. And thank you all this morning for your time and interest in listening to our stories. Thank you.
Tom, would you mind sending a copy of your testimony to Peggy Delaney
I sure will.
with the committee? Would appreciate that. And thank you for your comments. Are there questions for Mr. D?
Yeah, thank you for your testimony and your work. I have a couple of questions. You listed a bunch of things that you have put in place. The one thing that seemed like it might be missing is de-escalation training. Are all of your providers given de-escalation training?
Yes, they are. And certainly we can have one of our staff members, leaders in emergency room, Jill Maynard, can talk more about that. But we have been doing de-escalation training, both for our emergency room staff as well as our entire employee workforce. And our goal is that every one of our workers be trained in that. That's all part of our EVADE program.
Wonderful. And on your response team that you talked about, what is that team comprised of?
We're security personnel, management, social work people. And it's kind of called at a SWAT basis if there's if there's an intense situation developing. So we have 4 or 5 people who respond, who have been given training. And again, their approach is to try to de-escalate as much as possible.
Wonderful. Thank you. And is that when things start to escalate, is the first response to send 5 people into the room to interact with an individual that's struggling?
Well, I guess I'd rather have Jill Maynard answer that question because she's right in the first line. So I think she can give you a better response in terms of how we handle the triaging of these incidents.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Other questions for Mr. D? Tom, thank you very much. I will add that visiting various doctor's offices and the hospital, I do see those signs are in every office about behavior not being tolerated. And I do think they're helpful if people actually read them. So.
I agree, Senator. And again, I think it's important for us to communicate our expectations to the community that we're here to help, but we also have to have the right cooperation from everyone. And I think the signage and the other means of what we're doing through our communications department are very effective.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Our next witness is Jill Maynard, who's the Director of Emergency Services at SVMC. Jill, welcome to this joint hearing. I should have had everybody go around and introduce themselves for Tom as the first witness, but I'm going to do that now so that everyone who in the future who speaks will know who we are. If you could start.
Senator Terry Williams, Rutland County, and I'm from,
Hi, Jill. This is Martine LaRock-Ulick. I live in Burlington and I represent Chittenden Central.
Good morning. I'm David Weeks. I live in Proctor and I represent Rutland County.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for being here. I'm Ruth Hardy. I represent the Addison District and I live in Middlebury.
Good morning, Jill. Senator Ginny Lyons representing Chittenden Southeast. I chair the Health and Welfare Committee, and the four folks who've just introduced themselves are also on the Health and Welfare Committee.
And the next group would be Senate Judiciary. I'm Dick Sears, Jill. I think we know each other pretty well. And I live in North Bennington.
Hi, I'm Nader Hashim. I represent Windham County and I live in Dummerston.
I'm Senator Phil Baruth. I represent Chittenden Central District.
Senator Tanya Vyhovsky, I also represent Chittenden Central and live in Essex.
Senator Bob Norris. I represent Franklin County and I live in Sheldon.
Thanks, Jill. If you could go ahead.
Sure. Thank you so much. My name is Jill Maynard, and I currently serve as the Director of Nursing for the Emergency Department here at Southwestern Vermont Medical Center. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and be part of this important conversation. So I've been employed here at SVMC in the Emergency Department. This is my 20th year. And throughout the course of my career here, we've seen our fair share of challenges. When I look back at all of those challenges, though, this one for sure is like nothing that I've seen before. The current state of our emergency department and other emergency departments in our beautiful state, they're under siege. In fact, I have never once in my 20 years thought about leaving emergency medicine. It's really just part of who I am. However, over the past 12 months, I pondered leaving the ED, and on the most difficult days, leaving the profession altogether. And I know that I'm not alone when I say that, and I speak on behalf of many other nurses. And we're seeing that in our inability to recruit nurses to emergency departments. For the first 5 years of my career as the director, I had a waiting list. I had a waiting list of nurses wanting to be emergency room nurses. And now most emergency room nurses have emergency departments have vacancies that they can't recruit for. And I know that workplace violence is one of the big issues. And when you talk to people, they don't want to be part of that. In 2020, when the pandemic hit, nurses and other healthcare professionals were hailed heroes. The country practically rolled out red carpets. They showered healthcare workers with gifts, food, public displays of support, and generously donated protective equipment. Now here I stand in front of you in 2023 to tell you that those same people are now using nurses as punching bags. Nurses in emergency departments are there for you on your worst day. They're there to hold your hand when you're injured or ill. They sit with you and review the options the physician has provided you. They help you understand all of the medical jargon. They cry with you after you've been told that your child, your mother, your spouse, or your friend has died. When you walk into the emergency room, it is the nurse that identifies your life-threatening condition and swiftly acts to ensure you have the best chance of survival. What we do is step into your life-changing event and walk alongside you, lighting your path, and sometimes even carrying you when you're in your darkest moments. Workplace violence has always been present. It's been an issue that we've seen. However, the incidences have dramatically increased in the recent years. Not only the number, but the severity of them as well. Through COVID, although COVID led hospitals to become more flexible and more nimble, it's now left them in a vulnerable and frankly unsafe position. In the current state, hospitals and medical practices lack capacity, and the only place people know to go or can go for care is the emergency department. Due to no fault of their own, emergency departments are beyond capacity every day. There are no skilled nursing beds for your grandmother that you can no longer take care of. There are no pediatric intensive care unit beds for your child within a 6-hour radius of your home. And there are no ambulances to transport your husband to a major medical center for a life-saving stent when he has a heart attack. And there is absolutely no coordinated mental health services in the state of Vermont. This forces EDs to board patients for hours, days, or weeks. All of this leads to an increased risk of violence. In the past, healthcare workers, who by state law are classified protected, were made to feel guilty for calling the police when they were a victim of violence in the workplace. They were interrogated and informed that because they did not sustain severe physical injury, there was nothing that could be done. Or the patient had a mental health diagnosis, therefore they would not be held responsible for their actions. And in fact, this situation happened. I was injured at work. It was a 12-week recovery, but because there was no outward sign of physical injury, nothing became of that. No charges were brought, and that individual had no consequences for that action. Pursuing legal action often only leads to further traumatizing the healthcare worker in our current system. Once healthcare workers began to realize how ridiculous this was, they began to take a stand. Healthcare workers have come together to acknowledge that they are victims in a system where they have to continue to be victimized because offenders are allowed to languish in emergency departments or other clinical settings without consequences for their actions. The stand that they are taking is what has led us to this today, a well overdue conversation. Incidents of workplace violence not only threaten the safety of the healthcare team and the patient, they threaten the safety of the entire community. These situations often require multiple staff members, and in a small ED like SVMC, it can take the entire clinical team and the entire security team to handle this specific event. That means we have an entire department full of patients that have presented for emergency care left unattended. This might be one of your family members, and the doctor that they so desperately need to see is currently being assaulted across the hallway. I've been spit at, kicked, bit, had my hair pulled, been sexually harassed for hours on end, had my life threatened, and on one occasion, I was being tracked by a patient who threatened my life with a weapon that was later recovered from his vehicle after he was brought to the ED on a mental health warrant. He was brought to our ED because he threatened to commit a mass shooting, and there was probable cause to believe that it was a real threat. I want to be clear. He was transported to our ED by 4 armed officers. The community was put on lockdown, and law enforcement agencies across the state were called upon. However, this grown man, at least a foot taller than me, was dropped in my ED with a team of 6 nurses, all female, not a single one of them weighing over 130 pounds. He proceeded to terrorize our staff for days before a mental health facility would even consider accepting him. Shortly after his release from a very brief stay on an inpatient unit, he began to show up in places where I was. This included a dirt road near the driveway to my home, the home I was in with 2 small children. Although I had been reassured that his weapons had been taken from him, you and I both know how easy it is to get those things on the street. Imagine this, your daughter has committed her entire adult life to caring for others. In fact, I went into medicine when I was 16 years old. Well, I was a 3-star athlete and a straight A student in high school. That's how committed I was to caring for people. So your daughter goes into one of the most trusted professions in the country. She calls you to let you know that she had to have a meeting today with the police officers so she could learn tactics on how to keep herself safe. In this meeting, I was instructed to never walk unattended to my car, never drive home the same way twice, grocery shop out of town, and I was told not to bring my children into public spaces until the dust settled. I guarantee you would be demanding action. All of this simply because I showed up to my nursing job. My career has led me into a leadership role. As the nursing director of the ED, I take full responsibility for the safety and well-being of every staff member that reports to me. In fact, I probably lose the most amount of sleep because of this. They often look to me in the most extreme cases to create a plan for their safety. Handling incidences of workplace violence when we have limited to no resources are devastating to my team and to me as their leader. Another incident when I was called one early weekend morning. The staff member was crying and clearly distraught. He informed me that he wasn't sure how the team was going to get through the shift and the nurses were ready to walk out. an individual was brought to our ED, again, this time with 6 armed officers, on a mental health warrant. He has a history of mental illness, multiple assaults on healthcare workers and his family. These assaults have been career-ending, and one of them was nearly fatal. He was dropped in our emergency room, again with a team of nurses and security guards who were armed with only their hands. We have limited psychiatric support here in Bennington. In most small hospitals, you'll hear that throughout the day as well. He was deemed in need of involuntary treatment. He continued to terrorize the clinical team for the next 12 hours, sexually harassed the female staff members, used hate speech towards a staff member due to his gender identity. He made threats to kill specific individuals while making gestures with his hands like he would shoot or strangle them. He was very clear and in fact laughed about the fact that there'd be no consequences because he had a mental health diagnosis. When I arrived to the ED, the department was full of patients in need of emergency care. The staff were trying their best, but when your life is at risk, it's very difficult to remain focused on the work that's at hand. They were fearful for their lives. A nurse met me at the door. I hadn't even got my coat off or into my office. And she said, "You have to do something or I'm not staying. I have children at home and I need to go home alive today." After multiple calls, I was informed there wasn't a single law enforcement officer in the state that could come to our ED and support us. And I know that our executive management team would have pulled out anything to ensure our staff were safe. And that included having an officer in this department. When I met with the patient, the first thing he said to me as he looked through me in a bone-chilling look was, "Today's your day to die." After hours and multiple phone calls, the police department was finally given permission to remove this individual from the ED. However, the damage was done. It was too late. We almost lost multiple nurses on that day. And had those nurses not been supported by the leadership team here at SVMC, you can ask any one of them, they never would have returned. Every time we lose an ED nurse, it takes 9 to 12 months to recruit at a cost of probably $100,000 by the time they're trained and ready to go. Losing just one is crippling. Not only does it take time and money, but you can't replace experience. You can't replace a veteran ER nurse with a new graduate and receive the same level of care as quickly. We can no longer and will no longer tolerate this violence inflicted on us each and every day. Every day I walk out of that ED and I wonder which one of my coworkers is going to be injured tonight. It's just not acceptable. And we need your help to ensure that violent offenders can be removed from the ED and that there are consequences for their actions. So I really appreciate the time to be able to speak with you all, and I appreciate your willingness to hear what we have to say.
Thank you, Jill. Appreciate it. And if you have copies of your testimony, if you could send them to Peggy, I would appreciate that as well. Your very powerful testimony, which I was, are there any questions? Very well. Very good. Thank you, Jill. Appreciate it. Hopefully, our next witness is Patricia Johnson. Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much.
Full disclosure, Patricia's a neighbor and a friend, but her story was so powerful when I met with her, both at the hospital and privately had conversations. I thought it was important for this committee to hear that as well. So go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Senator Sears, and thank you all for coming out today. This is a life-changing measure, and it's needed now. I was born in this hospital on the 3rd floor, and I've resided in this community ever since then. I received my education at Southern Vermont College. It was in criminal justice. I began to work for Department of Corrections and left approximately 12 years ago to pursue a degree in nursing. And the reason why I wanted to become a nurse was I felt that I could make a stronger impact and have LWAS, we would say better patient outcomes. And I could be more hands-on and provide stronger care for the community. S10 is needed because it will help keep this hospital a safe zone. S10 is needed, or I'm sorry, S36 is needed because it will help ensure that the family member that I clock in with, I'm going to clock out with at the end of the day. S10 will provide, I'm sorry, S36 will ensure that I will not be pushed, jumped on, threatened, hate speech, bitten. S36 will ensure that when a patient decides to take off their clothes, get on top of a stretcher, I'll be able to call for help and they can be immediately removed. As you can see, I'm pretty rattled. And for full transparency, it's because this has caused a lot of trauma and it greatly affects the way that I'm able to carry on with daily tasks. S36 is needed because it will ensure my safety and raise my self-confidence again. It will allow me to protect the other patients that are in the emergency department, that when they see that we're being assaulted, they will not feel compelled to come run over and try to save me, putting themselves at risk. S36 will give me an opportunity to call the police when a patient is threatening my life, is escorted out of the hospital. And because he was removed by security, he was found lurking in the parking lot around my car. We assumed that he was waiting for me to walk out that door. Thank you for all you do. And if there's anything that you feel you can do to get this pushed through, or if you have any questions, I would be greatly appreciative of that. Thank you.
Thank you. The next was,
Can we get hers?
pardon me?
Can we get hers in writing as well?
Yeah, I'll check with her.
Yeah, okay.
We'll get her testimony. I'll take care of that. She was very nervous today.
I know.
And she's been through a lot.
I can tell.
The next witness is Devin Green, Vice President, Government Relations, Vermont Association of Hospitals and Health Systems, is here.
I'm here. I'm also giving you the option to continue to listen to provider testimony, and I can speak at the end, or I can speak now.
Okay.
We do Daniel.
Okay, well, why don't we go with Danielle Boudreau, who's here in person from Director of Progressive Care Unit, Northwest Medical Center. I don't know what oh, there you are. Yeah, if you want to sit where.
You're okay with that? Yeah, of course.
That's perfect.
Good morning. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak this morning and provide my testimony. My name is Danielle Boudreau. I'm a registered nurse. I've been a registered nurse for 15 years. As stated, I'm the director of the Progressive Care Unit at Northwestern Medical Center in St. Albans, and I'm here to show my support of S36. So I'm here today on behalf of my team of inpatient healthcare professionals to share some of the unfortunate interactions that have become a part of their everyday lives. Since taking the position as director of this unit, I've come to be a part in some way of each of these interactions. We have a workplace violence policy. It clearly defines what's considered workplace violence. We have a clearly defined reporting structure if workplace violence is experienced. De-escalation and response teams. We have consequences such as behavioral contracts, flagging of the medical records for security alerts or concerns, and notices of no trespasses up to and including potential investigation of possible criminal conduct by our local law enforcement. To a non-healthcare worker looking from the outside, it would seem to be a robust, strong policy put in place to protect our healthcare professionals. And yet it doesn't. It's a policy. It does not document, it's not a document that's binding and has legal implications for perpetrators' actions. In sitting down to write this testimony to present to you, I was taken aback by the sheer number of instances simply in the last week that we've experienced on our inpatient unit. This past weekend, a licensed nursing assistant, or an LNA, was attempting to assist a patient out of bed. The patient was at risk for falls, and the LNA was responding to a bed alarm that's in place to aid in the prevention of those falls. The patient became agitated with not being able to move freely about in the room and proceeded to kick the LNA in the stomach so violently she vomited as a reaction. The LNA returned to work, continuing to care for the other patients in her assignment. This is trauma. The social worker attempting to prepare a safe discharge for a patient was unable to obtain insurance authorization for an electric chair for a patient upon discharge. The patient's insurance declined, stating that there was not medical necessity. The patient blamed the social worker for the lack of ability to obtain an authorization for her insurance company and threatened to strangle the caseworker if she ever set foot in her room again. Another case manager took her place, but this is trauma. A patient requiring total care secondary to urinary and fecal incontinence, who also suffers from mental illness, was agreeable to being washed up by nursing staff. She had nursing staff on each side of the bed assisting with care, and while care was being provided, she reached out and grabbed the nurse's arm, scratching along the entire length of the forearm, drawing blood. The nurse received basic first aid and returned to work. It's trauma. An inpatient whose significant other was staying for support was refusing to wear his mask. He was informed that it was our policy for all visitors to remain masked for the safety of all of our patients and our staff. He became agitated, yelling at the nurse. At this time, the nurse appropriately escalated the concern to me. I entered the room, introduced myself, and explained our policy again. The visitor rose from his chair and stated aggressively, "Then we're going to have a problem." And at this time, I was forced to remove myself from the situation, de-escalated, for fear that I was going to be physically assaulted. That's trauma. Yesterday, we had a person present to the unit as a patient visitor. 2 years ago, this individual threatened to shoot both a medical provider and a case manager. At the initial time of the threat, a no trespass order was served. From a judicial perspective, due to the timeline, the no trespass order is no longer effective. Had we had legislation such as this bill being presented here today, the individual could have been criminally charged at the time. The presentation of this individual on the unit yesterday caused significant mental, physical, and emotional trauma to the case manager because she was working on the unit yesterday. She not only suffered trauma 2 years ago, but again yesterday. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a theory intended to reflect the universal needs of society. It's often depicted as a pyramid, with the base of the pyramid being the basic human needs. The very base is physiological: food, water, shelter. The next basic depicted is safety: personal security, emotional security, and health. As healthcare professionals, we come to work to provide a very vulnerable population of individuals care. The care we provide is highly specialized. And if provided under the wrong conditions, we know it can have devastating outcomes. And yet our healthcare professionals are being assaulted and traumatized on a regular basis. It's unsustainable. I want to leave you with one final thought. During basic life support and advanced cardiovascular life support certifications as providers, we're taught to assess the scene. Is the scene safe? If the scene is safe, we move forward and we provide care. I'm here to tell you the scene is not safe. It is not safe to provide healthcare.
Wonder if you got maybe other questions, but my question is, we heard from the director of nursing at Southwest Vermont Medical Center, CR, about losing staff. Are you losing staff in your?
We are.
At what kind of?
I think that a snapshot wouldn't be justified. I think over the years, we've seen an alarming number of bedside nurses leaving bedside nursing. I think our mental health, lack of ability to provide mental health care is a part of it. We have patients on the unit that have been there longer than a year that need placement. But, you know, when I started nursing 15 years ago, I started in Phoenix, Arizona at a level 1 trauma facility. And there were drugs and there were gangs and there were attacks, but they were against gang members, not nursing staff. The prevalence of attacks against staff just simply trying to provide healthcare is huge. It's just unsustainable to ask people to continue to come to work under these conditions. I think it's my responsibility to provide that safe environment, but I can't.
What kind of security do you have at Northwest?
So we have a security team. We also have we have security 24/7. We have a security officer on. We have a code green team that is specialized in responding to these types of incidents. They go through MANT training, which is similar to the training that Jill was speaking about before. It's reactive.
I know at Southwest Vermont Medical Center, the security staff has also been attacked on many occasions. Is that true at Northwest as well?
Yes, it can be anybody that's providing healthcare. We've had verbal attacks against our dietary staff.
Didn't like the food.
Get the creamer with the coffee.
Other questions? Senator Volkov.
What's the makeup of your Code Green response team? So it's a number of different individuals, and it really would depend on who's on for the day. But during the daytime hours and the nighttime hours, we have our security officer. We also have our head of security. They're responding during the day. There are leadership members that are trained, that go through the MANT training. And there are floor nurses that have gone through MANT training as well. What was the training? Sorry. MANT, M-A-N-D-T. Thank you. You're welcome.
Ask one question.
Yes, Senator Lyons.
Just a question. I think we're acutely aware of the need for step-down beds and some linkage within the community for mental health services, and understand that you're the place where everyone is. It's either the ED or beds that are taken up for that other folks should be in. Do you have, what kind of working relationship do you have with your Northwest Counseling Center? Is that something that has been developed?
Very well developed. We have a good partnership with NCSS, which is our counseling center. And unfortunately, they can't find
Capacity.
The capacity is not there.
And so we'll be looking at that in our committee a little bit, but certainly it's an ongoing issue across the state, and probably can ask any one of the hospitals who's been up here. But and your relationship with other hospital folks across the state, are you seeing the same thing?
We are.
Yeah.
We are.
We are all feeling it. Thank you for your testimony. Greatly appreciate it.
Are there any questions? Thank you. We were scheduled to have a break. Devin?
I can go now if you want me to.
Okay.
I just want to make sure that we get all the providers.
Well, I think we have some scheduled that after the break,
Yeah.
more providers, but
My schedule says our break's at 10:30. We've got 20 minutes.
yeah.
So Devin Green of Vermont Associations of Hospitals and Health Systems, and I really would like the providers to do most of the talking. They're feeling the impact, and I think as you'll see today, the impact it's nationwide, it's statewide, it's more acute than ever. And I want to start off just by talking, since I am the policy person, I do want to talk about this proposed law a little bit and what it would do potentially. So as we were talking about with domestic violence, I think this again is a policy position to say healthcare is different and needs to be treated differently. Healthcare is different because when you look at national data, 73% of all non-fatal workplace violence injuries occur in the healthcare sector. Out of all sectors, 73% are happening in the healthcare sector. So we are disproportionately impacted when it comes to workplace violence. Not only that, but the violence that happens impacts everyone. So unlike other sectors, when violence happens in a healthcare facility, that facility can go on lockdown. That means that people who are in emergency may get diverted. Other patients are impacted. And then our workforce is being impacted, as you've heard and you will continue to hear. Workforce is leaving. This is impacting access. It's also impacting the way our healthcare providers approach their patients and feel about their jobs. They have to take that much more energy just to do their job every day, to sort of deal with the trauma and continue to do their job every day. And I think you'll see some of the dedication here is really incredible. I think the other piece, just getting a little bit technical, I want to remind folks that under EMTALA, hospitals must serve people who are not stabilized. So if you are in an emergency, no one's going to get arrested who's in the middle of an emergency or anything like that. They must be stabilized first. They must be cared for first. That's not what we're trying to get at with this bill. Really what we're looking for is it's just a tool of clarification that will provide some immediate relief in some instances. I wish I could say that this bill would solve workplace violence, but it's not going to solve workplace violence. Our hospitals are going to continue to have to provide resources towards these efforts. We're going to have to work on our frayed social safety net and various services for people in the community. So the work doesn't stop here, but again, it's a tool that clarifies that in some instances, law enforcement can be called and they can immediately react to avoid a situation that could be more dangerous and impact more people, put a hospital into lockdown and divert people who are in emergency. So that's really what we're looking for when we talk about this. I think the other piece that folks might not know about is there are federal rules around when it's appropriate there are federal rules around law enforcement getting involved in patients, right? So normally it's not looked upon well if hospitals call law enforcement in without there being the idea that that person would be taken into custody. And so this would provide clarity instead of this gray area where healthcare providers are hesitating because they're worried about federal regulations, because they don't know if this person will be taken into custody or not. They don't know if this assault is serious or not. This would help provide some clarification there as well. So again, this is really a policy decision to show our healthcare providers that we support them. We understand the importance of safe healthcare organizations going forward and how it impacts all Vermonters. And we're really committed to doing one part to try to solve this issue. Yeah, again, these are deeply personal stories you'll be hearing today. I really appreciate your taking the time to listen to them. They're going to be difficult to hear, but really do appreciate the effort. I think the other thing I do want to put forward is we will have to have so actually I'm going to save that for any questions. But really appreciate you taking the time to listen to these stories from healthcare providers. So thank you.
Thank you. Senator Baruch.
Thank you, Ms. Green. I appreciate your testimony and all the testimony we've heard. It's not the first time the Judiciary Committee has heard testimony like this. Under Senator Sears, we've been investigating the trouble at hospitals for a while now. I wanted to check in on what we did last biennium, which was to prohibit firearms in hospitals. That particular piece of legislation required signage, among other things. Is that happening at Vermont hospitals?
Yes, that's my understanding that signage has gone up, and hospitals in response to all of this, they've included that signage as well as signage saying the expectations are that this is a safe space for patients and providers.
Okay, that's good to hear. And I will say that when we were working on that legislation, there were not a lot, but a few voices who said that hospitals' policies were enough. We didn't need a state law prohibiting firearms, that it was duplicative, in other words. And we've heard concerns today about the fact that we might be duplicating. as has been said in response to that, I really believe it's a policy decision to emphasize in the law and to allow, under the circumstances we've been talking about, warrantless arrests. So that seems to me a choice for our policy committees. I'm glad we're here and we're airing all of the different sides of it. But as Senator Sears said earlier, in the absence of a fully functioning mental health system, this is going to continue to happen. We've also heard from the corrections side that if we arrest these folks and we move them into custody, there are problems there in terms of staffing and facilities. So we're short all the way around, but I'm really glad that we're talking about this part of the problem. And I agree with you that I think this bill is necessary, and I appreciate you helping us move it along.
Thank you. Yeah, and just going off of Senator Hardy's comments, I mean, mental health is one aspect of this, but this workplace violence is perpetrated by visitors, it's perpetrated by family members, other types of patients, intoxicated individuals. It's a full spectrum of perpetrators, and that's why we think this law is one tool that could help deal with some of those populations.
Did you?
Yeah, just a quick comment. It's good to see you again, too. Thank you for coming up. Yeah, I wanted to say, you mentioned something in your testimony that I strongly agree with, which is you said that healthcare is different. And, when I'm thinking about this bill I mean, our hospitals and healthcare facilities in our state, that's what provides, life-saving care for people. It mitigates the lasting effects of injuries. And, of all the places, this is different. And, painting with a broad brush can create challenges. So that's why I think it's great that we're emphasizing the fact that healthcare is indeed different, and we should look at this on a certain level. So thank you.
Senator Hardy?
Yeah, thank you, Senator Shears. Thanks, Devin. In listening to the testimony, I've been just trying to figure out if we do pass this law, would it actually help? and I'm not, I think in some cases it certainly would, but I guess I'm trying to figure out a bit, obviously we need to do a lot more to shore up our mental health system, but are there other things that we could do within this context that would help more? Because I think that, I don't know, I'm not sure that this would give as much relief as clearly as necessary. And so I don't know, you don't need to answer that now, but just thinking about what else could be done that we might be able to accomplish this session would be, I think, helpful. And then I do have a question for Eric, if that's okay, Senator Sears.
Yeah, but I have a.
Answer.
Why don't we answer?
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
And then after we finish with.
Okay, I'm just, because I'm not as familiar with the criminal statute, so I have a question for Eric that's along this line, but go ahead.
Yeah, so I think this, again, this is not going to solve all of workplace violence, but I think it does play a potential critical role in certain scenarios. I hear a lot of times from healthcare providers, there was a simple assault, there was a threat, but we knew that nothing was going to happen. So we didn't call law enforcement, or we did call law enforcement and they were unable to respond and they were frustrated by that. And it escalated. So this would either prevent that sort of escalation by removing an individual from the situation, or prevent further harm from happening. Because as you'll see with the testimony, there are very real serious injuries that end up happening in these spaces.
It might be helpful to hear from law enforcement that would, to shore up that sort of like.
We do plan to hear from others.
Yeah.
I don't know whether it'll be joint hearings or separate, but we will definitely hear from law enforcement.
And just go, especially because I'm talking to you, Senator Hardy, the other thing that could be done to help protect healthcare workforce would be to provide a lot of folks are concerned about the fact that their licensure information is publicly available, and that people can find them through that. So one way to get around it is to list your healthcare organization as on your license. But I believe in the underlying paperwork, if someone were to do a Public Records Act request, they could still get that information. So if there was a way to protect that personal information, that would go a long way.
Oh, that's interesting. Let's
That's
discuss
a
that
tough
more.
one.
Yeah.
I mean, it's always what else can be done, and it's a good question. And, but I will point out that using the model that we've dealt with domestic violence, we still have domestic violence. No question about it, but think of where it would be at without some of the efforts we've made in the last few years to be preventative, as well as laws that allow the immediate arrest without a police officer having to see, or law enforcement officer having to see that domestic violence. I do have a question about the one group that quickly identifies something's wrong is the insurance industry.
Oh, no, I don't know if I can answer this one.
I'm not able to answer this, but have workers' comp rates gone up for nurses and others? And if you can't answer that, somebody could check into that.
I could check into that. Yeah, I'll check into that.
But I suspect that as injuries increase, the workers' comp rates will go up, even though here in Vermont, we've seen a decrease in workers' comp rates in other industries. And it would be a sign that this is very real. Not that I don't believe that it's real, by the way. But
It's very real.
I
said that it is
Yeah, I
very
know.
real. Yeah.
We're on the same page.
We do have our CEO of Northwestern Vermont Medical Center, is our new CEO is here, and he may be able to speak to it if you want an answer right now.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Peter Wright. I'm on day 3. So, I can tell you that in previous hospitals that I've worked at, the number one workers' comp location for police officers is hospital emergency departments in many, many communities. So I think when you look at workers' comp beyond what our nurses, as you've heard many times over, our nurses often don't report. If you work in the emergency department, getting kicked, getting punched is so frequently and such an everyday, multiple times a day offense that they've grown tired and they just go home injured without reporting. To me, that's one of the biggest dangers and the biggest traumas.
Thank you. Okay. Other questions for Devin?
I do have a question. I might save it, but I'll just bring up the issue that I've been reminded of. And that is the dispute resolution process that we're seeing in the ED or in a patient's room where the nurse is responsible, or the physician or the healthcare provider is responsible for de-escalating the patient. And that from our discussion in our committee around conflict-free resolution in some way, it really is concerning. So are there policies that can be put in place? This is a question I would have for us. Are there policies that can be put in place to ensure greater safety for folks who are in that process? I don't know if you can speak to that or if it's something we need to think about.
Yeah, I mean, so you're saying when the de-escalation team comes, or when a nurse is de-escalating one-on-one, or I think this policy can be put into place, right? If you go in and you try to de-escalate and it's not working, and the simple assault or the threat or those behaviors continue, then the healthcare provider knows that they have an option to truly de-escalate the situation by having an individual removed. And even if that person has to come back, it puts a hard reset on that whole wing so that people know what's happening when that person comes back. They can prepare, they can mentally prepare. And it really, truly would de-escalate the situation at that point.
And then to prevent in the first place. I understand this may serve as prevention, but there are probably other things that we can do. We'll consider that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Are there any other?
Just a general question, if it kind of falls in with what Senator Hardy said. If a person is in the hospital and is requiring medical attention, you withdraw them or they're arrested, where are they going to go to get that treatment? So that's another problem. It's a correctional facility they're going to go to doesn't have qualified people that can deal with that injury. Isn't that a liability of some sort?
Well, one difference I will say is that you would have correctional officers with that individual while they're being treated that presumably would prevent assault on the healthcare staff. That's actually one of the problems corrections has, is finding officers who can go to the hospital. They have to take them off shifts, but they have to send at least 2 officers with each patient who's going to be in the hospital. So there's a difference between being in custody and not being in custody. So I think here we're talking about a lot of people who are not patients, visitors, family members. I suppose family members are visitors, but people who are not the patient, who are causing some of the trauma. Getting upset because nobody's seeing my wife in 30 minutes. Where's the doctor? And I go out there and scream at the emergency room staff and then start to become, not me, but somebody becomes assaultive.
I think if, this law will do something, is anybody that's basically an honest person that respects the law knows that something's gonna happen to them. They're gonna respect the law.
It's hard to predict which laws are effective and which aren't. But since we know we've got a problem, I think we have to do something.
I think it's important to separate out the mental health issues from other issues, and that's something that we need, that's the gray area at sometimes. But we're hearing that we all know there are mental health needs for care management and continuity of care into the community. So, I don't know if we can solve all of these problems with this one bill, but we can certainly bring up some proposals that might ameliorate some of the problem.
Right. Again, this bill is not going to solve all of workplace violence, but it would send a strong signal to folks that workplace violence is unacceptable in healthcare facilities, and let the public know what is happening right now so that everyone can go into healthcare facilities realizing that they're stressed and maybe have some empathy for the healthcare providers and what they're going through. Since Senator Lyons brought up the mental health piece, I do want to say around mental health, I think we need to have a conversation about certainly there's a mental health piece where someone could have assaulted someone, but it is not a crime because they didn't understand what they were doing. And then there is also a piece in the mental health world where someone has a mental health issue, but they know what they're doing. They're making a decision, and that may require intervention with law enforcement.
Tanya.
So I absolutely want to address this, and I appreciate that you brought up that mental health isn't the only issue, because I think the other thing that we're seeing, and it's about capacity, we need to think about how we're building our capacity, not just in mental health, but in hospitals. I mean, I have certainly heard from constituents who were there with their child in crisis for 36, 48 hours, not being offered food, tucked in a back corner, not seeing someone for not 30 minutes, but 10 hours. And of course, people are going to get upset. And so I think that we have to have a bigger conversation about those underlying issues that have escalated to the point of crisis. And so I just want to steer us away from the mental health system is the problem, because I think it is part of a very large social and healthcare problem.
I think that's exactly right.
Quick comment again on, talking about sending a message almost as a deterrent, which, I think part of that makes sense, but I think it also, sends a message to our healthcare workers that there's a bit more teeth when it comes to the law and what police officers can do in emergency rooms and healthcare facilities, which I think will also help in making students and future nurses, future doctors feel like they're going into a profession where they're a bit more safe and that there's a bit more, there are a few more policies in place that will allow police to mitigate these issues.
Yeah, I think the healthcare providers would welcome this message, and we could even point to it when we're recruiting for folks as well.
Thank you.
I also have an Eric question.
Bob, did you have a question?
No, I'm all set. Thank you.
You had a question for Eric, or do you have one for Devin?
I have one for Eric. And it's maybe just to say it so that I don't forget it and Eric can look into it or whatever, think about it. But I'm looking, in hearing the testimony, one thing that struck me among many other things was the threats to healthcare workers. So they might not be assaulted, but they're being threatened. I think you testified to that. And so looking at 13 VSA 1702, which is the criminal threatening, over the last couple of years, we've added meat on those bones about threatening certain types of people and, social or department DCF people or workers, actually candidates and public officials. And it doesn't actually, there isn't, as far as I can tell, healthcare workers aren't called out in that. So that might be another area that we could clarify and provide a little bit more substance to, at least the threats that are waged against healthcare workers. And there may be others in the assault. I haven't looked through the statute. I'm not on the Judiciary Committee, so I just wanted to put that so that we can, when we mark up the bill, come back to thinking about that.
That raises thank you for doing that, because that raises an important thought to me. This bill just deals with them while they're in the healthcare facility. A couple of witnesses talked about being threatened outside, either where their car is or their way home or at their home, and their families being threatened.
Right.
I think we should take that into consideration as well. It's not just at the facility. And I don't know how to draft that, but
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that you can just add that as part of the categories that are specific to criminal threatening, but just trying to figure out how to, as I asked Evan, would this have an impact, other ways to have an impact that.
Well, I think we need to cover that.
Yeah.
While they're not necessarily at the facility.
I also had an Eric question. So a couple of people talked about things that had happened that they were unable to be sort of criminally charged with. But my understanding, and I thought this was already clarified, is this bill changes nothing that is able to be criminally charged. It simply changes whether or not someone can be arrested. So if people currently aren't being criminally charged for things, this isn't going to change that, correct?
That's right.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, it would be basically based on the affidavit of the healthcare professional who was assaulted, for example, rather than having the police officer have to witness the assault.
Yeah, and that was my understanding. I just heard a couple of people talk about things that frankly probably should be criminally charged that weren't able to be. And I just wanted to make sure my understanding was clear that this would not change that.
Yes, if you want to fix that too, we would welcome that. I think for now, we were really looking at that sort of immediate relief piece of having a tool to be able to call law enforcement and have someone immediately be removed. And we recognize that there are issues down the road in the criminal justice process, but this was our priority.
Calling somebody to take a different route to work each day there's probably, there are better ways to solve that problem.
And then I had one other question that may be a question for you, or it might be a question for Eric, but these protective no trespassing, does that mean that someone would not ever be able to come to that hospital again and get care?
They could get, so under EMTALA, if they're having an emergency and they need care, the hospital would have to take them for care.
What level of emergency? I know that there's so many people who don't have access to regular medical care and use the emergency department as their primary care physician, which is a whole other problem that is leading into this problem. But I want to find a way to thread the needle to keeping people safe, but also making sure people can get health care.
Yeah. I think it depends on the conditions of the no trespass order, so it varies.
You keep taking.
So I'd have to look into it more.
Thank you.
Why don't we get back together at 10:45 and take